In part 4, we're going to take a look at setting up the lighting for this scene. I've already set up the materials. We'll do a separate tutorial on that, and we're simply going to focus on setting up the lighting. And this is going to be pretty easy because the lighting for this doesn't need to be very sophisticated. We're going to bypass the typical lighting sources like a point and a spotlight, for instance, and we're going to use an area light approach, but we're not even going to use the area light mechanism. And that'll become apparent in just a minute. The first thing I've done is I've set up a backdrop. If we take a look at this, I've got an object that I've applied this bitmap to. And the bitmap for that, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's sort of a secondary thing, is just a principled BSDF with the bitmap that I created in Photoshop, the burst, applied into the base color, and I've also taken that and I've applied it into emission with a little bit of emission strength applied to it. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to come in and create a polygon that's going to function for a lighting source. And we can come in, and the first thing that we want to do is sort of analyze our objects. We've got 3 of these objects, and they're all sort of randomly posed, but when we look at it, we've got one and then another one that have roughly similar orientations, and then the third one is facing off in a different direction. So we really can get away with having just 2 light sources in order to really properly light this scene. So the next thing that we want to do is just take a look at where our camera is. I've got camera turned off, the collection for that. We can see that our primary camera is just sort of front facing. And that's important because the way that we're going to think about applying our light is going to be relative to the incidence angle of our view position to the surface that we're wanting to light. We're going to focus on these 2 that have roughly similar angles. In the world of 3D, we think about light in very physical ways. When a light source strikes a surface, it bounces off that surface, but it does so in a very regular way. And the more mirror-like the surface is, the more regular the way the light bounces off that surface. So for instance, when you look at the incoming angle of a light ray hitting a mirror type of surface, think of it as a very shiny, polished surface. The bounced angle at that point is a simple inverted or mirrored angle to the incoming ray. It's a very simple sort of thought process if you want to think about it. And we can actually use that very simple understanding of light to place our lights in the 3D scene. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over and just look at the fact that we've got our camera, and if we just roughly draw a line to that surface, and then we roughly kind of traverse off at an inverse angle relative to this surface, then you kind of get a sense where it is that you want to place the light to receive sort of maximum illumination on that surface. So here's how we're going to approach this. Once you've kind of gained an understanding of this, it's much easier to just place the light and kind of have a sense about where to place it. But I'm going to show you an interesting trick that can help you to place the light. So what I want to do is come over to one of our objects, the one that's on the right, and I'm going to select it. We're going to do Shift S, and I'm going to do cursor to selected, and we want to insert an object at that position. But what I'm going to do first is we want to come up here to where it says, you see where it says local under transform orientation. By default, it'll be global probably. We want it to be local. And in fact, what I want to do is define a custom orientation based on that. So you can see I've already got one right here. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. We're going to come back to local, and then I'm going to press the plus key, and we're going to define a custom orientation or axis based off the local orientation of this object. Press Shift A, and we're going to come down to mesh, and we're going to do a plane, and it's just going to insert it in a default world orientation. Let's change this to 12 inches. I'm using inches. If you're European, you'll probably hate me for that. But what I want to do is align it to that local orientation of that object. So we're just going to come up to Object, Transform, and then we're going to come down where it says Align to Transform Orientation. And there it is. So it's aligned it right there. Well, the cool thing is now we can just come up and we can kind of pull that off. Now, if we take a look at this basically from the top again, let's look at our camera. So clearly, if we draw a line here to here, it's not off over here. But what we've done is we've moved that on a normal orientation to that surface. And that normal orientation would be the line that we would be measuring an angle. So for instance, if I come over and just do an annotation, if I draw from the camera position to that angle, and then we have basically a normal line coming off that surface. So the opposite angle would be an inverse of this angle right there. So we just want to think about it in those terms. So what I would do is once I've established that, then I can come over and I can roughly move it to about an opposite angle like that. Now, the challenge here is that we're not getting the light to be still focusing its light intensity at the scene. So what we want to do is we want to come over here to constraints, and I want to add a track to constraint. Now you can see in the scene, I've already set up a light target. So let's select that. I just put an empty in the middle of the scene, world 000 position. And coming back to our emitter, what I'm calling an emitter, we're going to come back over to our constraints target, and I'm going to tell it to target that light right there. Okay, so you can see the line clearly right here. So if I come back over and annotate that, you see we get roughly about the position that we want. So that's going to help to provide more visibility. Now, from an artistic standpoint, we're going to be making some adjustments, but this is just a general thought process to help you understand where to place the light to give it emphasis. So if we come up to the front and let's select the camera. So the camera is there. We ideally would probably want to have this down a little bit like that. So let's come in now and actually assign a material to this. So what I want to do is come down to the material here, and we're going to click new, and I'm just going to call this light panel 1. And we just need to come down and let's give this an emission strength of 9. That would be 9 watts. And then we also need to make this white, okay? And that 9 watts is the amount of energy that's coming off the entire surface. If you were to decrease this panel in half, it would still be 9 watts coming from that entire surface. What I want to do right off the bat, I'm going to have us turn off the backdrop because I don't want us to visualize that. I'm going to come over here now and I'm just going to have us turn on. I'm using cycles. We're going to turn that on. So you can clearly see how that allowed me to get a really good sense about where to place the light to get sort of maximum emphasis in that location. So let's come in and do some really quick fine tuning. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom way in so we're seeing sort of this area. I'd like this panel to highlight on the clear plastic that we have up here a little bit more. So I'm just going to sort of move this until we can see that panel reflecting. And then I'll come up here and I'll just do some adjustments looking at these reflections until I get something sort of artistically that I like. So, you know, it's a little bit different than the angle over here, but roughly it matches the outgoing angle from the incoming angle. It's basically the thought process. Okay, so let's do this now. Let's do the same thing. I'm going to come over and remove these. And we want to do the same thing for the other side. Turn off that. So I'm going to do Shift S, cursor to selected. Let's come back over here and remove that custom angle. I'm going to reset it to local. Shift A, and then we're going to do mesh plane. Okay, and we want to make it 12 inches. And then we just come up to object, transform, align to transform orient. Let me try that again. Oh, I didn't. This is what I didn't do. I didn't create a custom orientation based off local. So there we go. So now I can come back to the panel that I just created, transform orientation, align. There we go. Pull it out and then move it over a little bit. We need to come over and apply the constraints. So we're going to do track 2. We're going to track to the light target right there. Okay, so now when we move it, it kind of maintains, and we'll come over and we're going to assign the same material, light panel 1, and then we'll come back, zoom out. In fact, let me look at this. You know, one of the things that drives me nuts is, do you see this big black triangle? That's from the camera, and it's enormous. Okay, let's turn this on, and there we go. So we've gotten that. It's probably over bright at this point, but that's okay. We're just going to move this around a little bit until we can kind of see how it's affecting the surface. The next thing that we're going to do is attenuate the lighting, but not in a way that you would think. If we come back over here and we take a look at this, we can see these reflections. We would technically think about these reflections off the glossiness of that clear plastic. They're too sharp and everything is too bright. So before we try and make any more adjustments, we want to come in and deal with this to make that look more artistically interesting. So what we're going to do is to come over to the shading tab, and we're going to look at the material that we have applied, light panel 1, and it's a really basic, just principled BSDF shader with an emission. But that reflection is just way too sharp, and it's also just way too sort of bright. So we're going to come over here and we're going to do an image texture. And with the start file, we're going to come over here to open, and we're going to navigate to where it says textures. And I've created a bitmap called panel fade. This is just something that I created in Photoshop. It's just this gradient. And I just use the gradient tool to create this basic feathering effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back over and we're going to load this image texture. Since it's grayscale, we want to make sure that we're setting it to non-color. And we're going to take this and we're going to drive it into alpha. And notice what happens is that the light isn't quite so bright, and we get a nice sort of feathered effect. Do you see how it looks more organic? And I just think that works so much better. So this is where now you would come in and you would say, okay, now I think I can start playing a little bit more with placing that light by coming into the front and just, you know, playing around with the position until you get something that artistically you like. Now, in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to make it even a little bit more interesting, because right now the light is a little bit antiseptic. So what we want to do now is we want to take this just very basic white light and do something a little bit more interesting with it. If we come over and take a look at this, it's a pure white light. And so we could add color to it easily. I mean, that's obviously something that we could do, is take emission and apply emission color to it. I would like to do it in a little bit more physically correct way. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and make this right light that we have a separate material from the left one. So I'm going to click this the little 2, and I'm going to turn this into light panel, and we'll just call this cooler. And then we're going to come over here, black body, and put that right there. And I'm going to change the temperature, and let's make this 8,000. Drive that into emission. And 8,000 is going to be pretty white, so we're not really going to see a whole lot change here. In fact, we could change this to 10,000. And that's going to shift it from pure white to more of a slightly blue tint to it. But that's not going to be hugely apparent. I mean, you can see a slight blue cast to it now. But if we come over to the other panel on the other side, we're going to do the same thing. Let's do a black body. And this one we're going to change to 3,000. What this does is it says if you have the black body is in kelvins, it's how hot you need to make a surface in order for it to emit light that has a particular color to it. So we're going to do 3,000, and 10,000 is a lot hotter, and that means it's going to produce more of a bright blue light, whereas 3,000 is cooler, and that's going to produce a warmer light, like that. So you can see now, if we zoom in up here, we've got that nice warm cast to it. It's still kind of white over on this side because the Kelvin is pretty high. But that is a nice thing you can do to give it a little bit of color variation. If it's too strong, then you can play with increasing that to produce something that maybe isn't quite so heavily colored in the orange. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the size and the position of these lights to get something that's even more interesting, I think. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to change the lights. In fact, let me come back over to layout because we're going to leave the colors alone. Do you see here how it's sort of flat in terms of illumination? I'd like to maybe change it to make it just look a little bit more dramatic. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come over and let's turn off interactive rendering for right now. Press the N key and we're going to change the size to 5.5 inches and we're going to change the size here on this one to 5.5 inches. But because they're farther away, there's not going to be as much illumination. So we'll come over here and turn that back on. It's gotten quite a bit darker, so we can move the lights in. So let's talk about the inverse square law for a minute. We're not going to do an extensive discussion about this, but the inverse square falloff law says that when light leaves a surface, for every doubling of a distance, you have a quarter of the amount of light as from the previous position. So you can arbitrarily define a distance from the light, double that, and the light at that doubled position will be a quarter of the amount of light from the previous position. And we can kind of use this to help us, in a rough sort of way, know where to place the lights in order to get more illumination here. But it's going to have another effect in that it's going to cause more of a kind of a gradation across the surface. So if we come into the front here, let's do this. Let's come back over and let's change each light to local so I can move the light along just the local axis. And you can see I'm going to get that quite a bit closer. Well, obviously that gives me quite a bit more illumination. And let's do the same thing to the other. Let's bring this in quite a bit closer. And there we go. So this produces a little bit more interesting and dramatic lighting. But the interesting thing to note is that because of the inverse square fall off, if we look at a position, let's say define a point right here is the first position. If then we double that, this doubled position is receiving quite a bit less light. Well, that quick rapid fall off is something you can kind of see as a gradation happening right here on the backdrop. And we can also see on this surface, there's a slight gradation going across the surface, and that's because of the fall off. So that actually works to our benefit. We can clearly see here there's more illumination here and less down here, and this lighting gradation, as I'm calling it, just makes the surface look a little bit more interesting.